Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Okay, good. Well, today we're tackling those obstacles to spiritual growth, the ones that we all kind of struggle with. And we're going through a sermon called Make Disciples 2.
Okay.
And hoping to uncover some practical ways to, let go of things that are holding us back.
Yeah.
Experiencing all that God has for us.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, for sure.
And the pastor in this sermon uses this powerful analogy of a ship at the dock. But the engines are roaring, but it's not going anywhere.
It's a brilliant image.
Yeah.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
It really captures that feeling of when you're putting in all the effort.
Yes.
And you're making noise even.
Yeah.
But you're not actually moving forward.
Yes.
And what's fascinating is that the sermon, connects this to the Great Commission.
Okay.
The call to go and make disciples of all nations. And it suggests that sometimes before we can effectively share our faith and lead others, we need to address what's keeping us tethered to the dock ourselves.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah.
So the big question is what are those dock lines?
Right.
What are they? What are they? This sermon offers a pretty extensive list, and some of these really hit close to home for me, you know?
It's a list that resonates on both a personal and universal level, I think.
Yes, totally.
And the pastor starts with pride and how it can manifest in our deep concern over other people's opinions.
Yeah.
Or a reluctance to fully surrender to God's plan.
Yeah.
And I remember once my grandmother, with the best intentions, of course, suggested I have a plan B in case ministry didn't work out.
Oh, wow.
And it made me realize how fear, disguised as practicality, can be a powerful anchor.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
We're so afraid of failing or looking foolish that we hold back from fully embracing what God might be calling us to.
Exactly. It's we get so fixated on a particular vision of success or happiness that we miss the unexpected detours.
Oh, yeah.
And redirects that God might be using to lead us to something even greater.
Wow.
It's about surrendering our limited perspective to his infinite wisdom.
It's almost like needing to empty our hands before we can receive something new, wouldn't you say?
And what the sermon highlights is that the things we cling to aren't always bad.
Okay.
In and of themselves.
Okay.
Even our successes.
Right.
If we allow them to inflate our ego or shift our focus away from God, they can become stumbling blocks.
Oh. Interesting.
And the pastor uses this really captivating anecdote about passengers on a sinking ship during the gold rush.
Oh, yes. The story about them drowning.
Precisely.
Because they couldn't let go of their gold.
It's such a stark reminder that what we perceive as valuable can become a deadly weight if it prevents us from reaching for what truly matters. Right. Our relationship with God and his purpose for our lives.
That's pretty intense imagery.
Yeah.
It makes you think what other valuable things are we holding on to that are actually holding us back? And the sermon touches on things like unhealthy habits, relationships that drain us, or even jobs that compromise our values. It's interesting how it frames these things, not necessarily as inherently evil, but as potential dock lines that keep us tethered to a life that's, less than what God intends.
What's striking is that it doesn't just focus on obvious vices.
Right.
It also points to more subtle things like doubts, anxieties, even past hurts, failures,
Oh, yeah.
Those things can fester in our hearts, weighing us down emotionally and spiritually.
It's like they become these chains that bind us to the past and prevent us from stepping into the fullness of what God has for us in the present.
And even seemingly positive things like financial security or comfortable routines, can become dock lines.
Wow.
If we prioritize them over following God's call.
Yeah. It's so easy to get distracted by the things of this world.
Yes.
Even things that seem harmless on the surface.
The pastor uses this really poignant example of churches that get stuck in the past, unable to move forward because they're still clinging to old conflicts and hurts.
I've seen that happen. It's the energy of the entire community gets sucked into this black hole of unresolved issues.
Right.
But it's not just churches, is it?
No.
We all have our own personal black holes. You know, those past hurts and resentments that we replay over and over in our minds?
It's true. And the sermon challenges us to consider how those unresolved issues, those dock lines from the past, might be impacting our ability to live fully in the present and embrace the future God has for us.
Okay, so we've identified some of these dock lines, but how do we actually start letting go of them?
Right.
Like, where do we even begin?
The sermon suggests that the first step is like honestly acknowledging what those dock lines are.
Yeah.
It's about being willing to look inward, perhaps with God's help.
Yeah.
And identify those things that are keeping us tethered to the dock.
Okay.
Preventing us from moving forward in our spiritual journey.
So it sounds like a lot of this comes down to like self-awareness.
Yes.
Being honest with ourselves.
Absolutely.
About what we're holding on to, even if it's painful.
It's about cultivating that inner awareness.
Yeah.
That sensitivity to the subtle ways in which our thoughts and emotions and even our physical habits can become dock lines.
Yeah.
And the sermon emphasizes that this process of letting go is not about achieving some kind of stoic detachment.
Okay.
Or suppressing our feelings.
So it's not about like becoming robot.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that our emotions are part of who we are, but they don't have to control us. The key is to like bring those emotions to God, to surrender them to his healing and transforming power. And the pastor shared a couple of verses from the Bible that I found particularly helpful in this regard.
I'm all yours.
Okay. One is Ephesians 4:22. Which talks about putting off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires.
Right.
It's a reminder that letting go is an active process. A deliberate choice to shed those old patterns and embrace a new way of being.
That's a great point. It suggests that we have agency.
Yes.
So we're not just victims of our past or circumstances. We can choose to let go of those things that are no longer serving us.
And the other verse is Hebrews 12:1. Which encourages us to run with endurance the race that is set before us, laying aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us.
Yeah.
This speaks to the ongoing nature of this process.
Yeah.
It's not a one-time event, but a continuous journey of shedding those things that hinder us.
Right.
And pressing forward towards the goal of becoming more like Christ.
So it's about progress, not perfection.
Exactly.
That's encouraging because sometimes it feels like the list of things to let go of is never ending.
You've hit upon a crucial point. The sermon emphasizes that we don't need to achieve some level of spiritual perfection before we can start moving forward. In fact, it's often in the midst of our imperfections, our struggles, and our messy attempts to let go that God meets us and does his most transformative work.
There's that grace again. I think we all need that reminder.
We do.
Sometimes. It's not about cleaning ourselves up before we come to God. It's about coming to him just as we are with all our baggage.
Exactly.
And allowing him to work in us, to help us loosen our grip on those things that are holding us back.
Beautifully put. And the pastor actually uses this very powerful phrase, you are not controlled or defined by your past unless you choose to be.
Wow, that's really profound. It's a reminder that we have the power to choose how our past affects us. We can choose to be defined by our mistakes and hurts, or we can choose to let them go and allow God to use them for our good and his glory.
The sermon also highlights the importance of seeking support from other believers, especially when the process of letting go feels overwhelming or insurmountable. It's about finding a community where we can be honest about our struggles, encourage one another, and remind each other of God's grace and power.
I think that's so important. It's easy to feel isolated in our struggles.
Yes, it is.
But when we share them with others, we realize that we're not alone.
Right.
There's something incredibly liberating about being able to confess our weaknesses and receive support and encouragement from those who understand what we're going through.
The sermon also encourages us to develop a habit of gratitude, focusing on what we have rather than dwelling on what we lack. This shift in perspective can be transformative, helping us to appreciate the blessings in our lives and loosen our grip on those things that we've been clinging to out of fear or insecurity.
That makes a lot of sense. When we're focused on all the things we don't have, it's easy to feel anxious and dissatisfied, which can lead us to grasp even tighter to the things we do have. But when we cultivate an attitude of gratitude,
yes,
we create space in our hearts for contentment and peace.
absolutely.
Which in turn makes it easier to let go of the things that are no longer serving us.
The sermon also emphasizes the importance of forgiveness, both of ourselves and of others.
Right.
This can be one of the most challenging aspects of letting go because it requires us to release our grip on anger, resentment, and the desire for retribution.
Forgiveness is definitely not easy.
It's not.
It's so much easier to hold on to those hurts and grudges. But the sermon makes a compelling case.
It does.
For why it's so essential for our spiritual growth.
It's a powerful message.
Yeah.
The pastor reminds us that holding on to bitterness and unforgiveness only harms us in the end.
Right.
Poisons our hearts, clouds our judgment, and prevents us from experiencing the fullness of God's love and grace.
It's like we're drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
Exactly.
So how do we actually start to forgive, especially when the hurt is deep and the wounds are still fresh?
The sermon acknowledges that forgiveness is a process.
Okay.
And it often requires us to lean heavily on God's grace.
Right.
It's not about condoning the wrong that was done or pretending that it didn't hurt.
Right.
It's about choosing to release the other person from our judgment and entrusting the matter to God.
So it's not about forgetting or minimizing what happened, but about choosing to let go of the anger and bitterness that keeps us bound to the past.
Precisely. And the sermon points out that sometimes forgiveness is a decision we make over and over again.
Right.
Especially when those painful memories resurface or the wounds feel fresh again.
Yeah.
But each time we choose to forgive, we take another step towards freedom and healing.
That's a helpful perspective. It takes the pressure off having to achieve some kind of instantaneous, perfect forgiveness.
Right.
It's about recognizing that it's a journey, and it's okay to stumble along the way.
The sermon also suggests that one of the most practical ways to let go is to simply shift our focus.
Okay.
Instead of dwelling on the things we're trying to release, we can intentionally redirect our attention to things that are positive, life-giving, and in alignment with God's will.
That's interesting. It's almost like a mental detox. Instead of feeding our minds with negativity and fear, we can choose to fill them with truth, hope, and gratitude.
Exactly. The sermon encourages us to engage in practices that nourish our souls and draw us closer to God. Things like spending time in nature, listening to uplifting music, reading scripture, praying, and serving others.
Those are all great suggestions. It's about creating space in our lives for the things that truly matter and allowing those things to crowd out the negativity and clutter that can so easily accumulate in our minds and hearts.
The pastor emphasizes that letting go is not a passive process. It requires intentionality, effort, and a willingness to surrender our will to God's. It's about actively choosing to release our grip on the things that are holding us back and allowing God to lead us into the fullness of life that He has for us.
So it's not about sitting back and waiting for God to do everything. It's about actively participating in the process, making those difficult choices, and trusting God to meet us in those moments of surrender.
The sermon also points to the importance of renewing our minds through God's Word.
Okay.
It's about replacing those negative thought patterns and limiting beliefs with the truth of God's promises. As we meditate on Scripture and allow it to transform our thinking, we begin to see ourselves and the world around us through God's eyes.
I love that image of renewing our minds. It's like we're taking out the old, outdated software and installing a brand new operating system that's designed to run on God's grace and power.
And as we allow our minds to be renewed by God's Word, we'll find it easier to identify and release those dark lines that have been holding us back. We'll begin to see those things not as essential parts of our identity, but as temporary obstacles that can be overcome through Christ's strength.
This is all so helpful. It's like you're giving us a whole toolkit for letting go and moving forward in our spiritual lives.
And the beautiful thing is that this toolkit is available to everyone.
Right.
Regardless of where they are in their spiritual journey. Whether you're just beginning to explore your faith or you've been walking with God for years, the principles outlined in this sermon can help you identify and release the things that are preventing you from experiencing the fullness of God's blessings.
So it's not about having all the answers or reaching some predetermined level of spiritual maturity.
Yeah.
It's about being willing to take that first step.
Yes.
To acknowledge our need for God's grace and to trust Him to lead us through the process of letting go and moving forward.
Exactly. And the sermon makes it clear that this process of letting go is not just about our own personal benefit.
Oh, okay.
It's about freeing us up to more effectively live out the Great Commission to be more impactful witnesses for Christ and to make a difference in the world around us.
That's an important point. It's not just about our own personal growth or happiness. It's about becoming more like Christ so that we can reflect his love and grace to others.
And that's where the true power of letting go lies. It frees us from the shackles of our past, the anxieties of the present, and the fears of the future, enabling us to step boldly into the purpose God has for our lives.
So it's almost like it's saying, okay, you've dealt with your own baggage. Now, how are you going to help others with theirs?
Yeah, it's a powerful connection. The pastor emphasizes that our ability to effectively share the gospel is directly tied to our own spiritual health and freedom. If we're weighed down by dock lines, it's going to be much harder to extend a hand to others who are struggling.
Yeah, you can't lead somebody out of a pit if you're stuck down there yourself, right?
Precisely. And the sermon reminds us that being a disciple of Christ isn't just about what we say, it's about how we live. It's about embodying the love, grace, and truth of the gospel in our everyday interactions with others.
You know, it's funny you should mention that. I was talking to a friend recently who isn't a believer, and she said something that really stuck with me. She said, I'm not opposed to God. I'm opposed to the way some Christians act.
Wow.
And it was like a real wake-up call for me to consider how my own behavior might be impacting others' perceptions of faith.
That's such a powerful insight. It reminds us that we're all ambassadors for Christ, whether we realize it or not. And the way we live our lives can either draw people towards him or create barriers that make it harder for them to see his love and grace.
It's like we're walking billboards for the gospel.
Yeah.
And if the message on the billboard is unreadable or off-putting, it's not going to be very effective.
Exactly. So this process of letting go, of shedding those dock lines, becomes not just about personal transformation, but about becoming more effective witnesses for Christ.
So it's not just about decluttering our own hearts and minds, but about clearing the path for others to encounter God's love more freely. It's almost like we're creating space, not just for ourselves to grow, but for others to grow as well.
That's beautifully said. And I think that's where the true power of letting go really shines. It frees us up to be more loving, more compassionate, more Christ-like in our interactions with others. It allows us to reflect his light more brightly and be a beacon of hope and healing in a world that desperately needs it.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this sense of excitement and possibility. It's like we've cleared out all the clutter, we've set sail from the dock, and now we're finally free to chart a course towards the amazing adventure God has planned for us. And even more exciting, we can invite others to join us on the journey.
And that journey, as the sermon reminds us, starts with a single step. It starts with letting go of one thing, one burden, one limiting belief that's been holding us back. So as you reflect on what we've discussed today, I want to leave you with this question. What is one specific thing you can release today, right now, to allow God to move you forward?
It could be a grudge, a fear, a bad habit, or even a dream that's no longer serving you.
Whatever it is, give it to God. Trust his guidance and watch in amazement as he sets you free to soar.
And as you do, remember that you're not alone on this journey. God is with you every step of the way, and so are we. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's interesting how it brings the Great Commission back into focus here.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, you've dealt with your own baggage. Now, how are you going to help others with theirs?
Yeah, it's a powerful connection.
Yeah.
The pastor emphasizes that our ability to effectively share the gospel is directly tied to our own spiritual health and freedom.
Right.
Like if we're weighed down by dark lines, it's going to be much harder to extend a hand to others who are struggling.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
Yeah, you can't lead someone out of a pit if you're stuck down there yourself, right?
Exactly.
Right.
And the sermon reminds us that being a disciple of Christ isn't just about what we say. It's about how we live. It's about embodying the love, grace, and truth of the gospel in our everyday interactions.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that. I was talking to a friend recently who isn't a believer, and she said something that really stuck with me.
Oh, yeah?
She said, I'm not opposed to God. I'm opposed to the way some Christians act.
Wow.
And it was like a real wake-up call for me to consider how my own behavior might be impacting others' perceptions of faith.
That's such a powerful insight. It reminds us that we're all ambassadors for Christ, whether we realize it or not.
Yeah.
And the way we live our lives can either draw people towards him or create barriers that make it harder for them to see his love and grace.
Yeah, it's like we're walking billboards for the gospel, you know, and if the message on the billboard is unreadable or off-putting, it's not going to be very effective. So this process of letting go, shedding those dock lines, it becomes not just about personal transformation, but about becoming more effective witnesses for Christ.
Right.
So it's not just about decluttering our own hearts and minds, but about clearing the path for others to encounter God's love more freely. It's almost like we're creating space not just for ourselves to grow, but for others to grow as well.
That's beautifully said. And I think that's where the true power of letting go really shines. It frees us up to be more loving, more compassionate, more Christ-like in our interactions with others. It allows us to reflect His light more brightly and to be a beacon of hope and healing in a world that desperately needs it.
You know, as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this sense of excitement and possibility. It's like we've cleared out all clutter, we've set sail from the dock, and now we're finally free to chart a course towards the amazing adventure God has planned for us.
Yeah.
And even more exciting, we can invite others to join us on the journey.
And that journey, as the sermon reminds us, starts with a single step. It starts with letting go of one thing, one burden, one limiting belief that's been holding us back. So as you reflect on what we've discussed today, I want to leave you with this question. What is one specific thing you can release today, right now, to allow God to move you forward?
Yeah, it could be a grudge, a fear, a bad habit, or even a dream that's no longer serving you.
Whatever it is, just give it to God.
Yeah.
Trust His guidance and watch in amazement as He sets you free to soar.
And as you do, remember that you're not alone on this journey. God is with you every step of the way, and so are we. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.